everybody and welcome back to a brand new video where it is Thursday the 2nd of April 2020, which means that it's exactly 15 years to the day since the second ever episode of new Doctor Who aired, The End of the World. And so yes, thank you for your response to last week's video of Rose. I really enjoyed reading your comments about it. It was great to just discuss it again and just really relive the memories of that wonderful start to New Who 15 years ago. And so today we move on to episode 2 in this continuing series where I'm kind of reviewing them, kind of just discussing the episodes generally and the sort of opinion of the time and just sort of things around it. So yeah, today we get stuck into the second episode, The End of the World, where it's follows this pattern that certainly Russell T Davies wanted to establish right at the beginning of New Who, of sort of in the first 3 or 4 episodes of every series, kind of telling a story, each of the different types of stories you could do in Doctor Who. So have a present day Earth story, have a story set in the future or on an alien planet, and have a story set in the past. And we see that straight away come out in series 1 where we've had the present day alien invasion of Rose, and now in this episode we've got the futuristic space station, end of the world type story with loads of aliens and craziness. And then of course next week in The Unquiet Dead we go to a historical story, so it's straight away setting out that idea into the show. And I think it works really effectively, particularly when you're starting off this new show, to just kind of introduce the audience to all the different things that Doctor Who can do and the storytelling opportunities that it has when it's so free, being able to travel in anywhere in time and space. It gives you so many opportunities, and it's great that we explore those straight away in those very early episodes of the series. To an extent, I think the pressure would have been off with an episode like this because you kind of had the the exciting opening episode that's very much got your audience engaged and interested and willing to kind of come back for the next week. Of course, it's important for the following episodes to be good to kind of maintain that momentum, but I don't feel like it's got quite the same pressure this story has, which is probably to an extent why it is a little bit more wacky sci-fi than what we see in the opening episode, because I mean we're thrust straight into this futuristic space station and more different aliens than you could shake a stick at, frankly. Like, it's crazy the amount of different aliens in there. It's really impressive visually. Like, this is the sort of thing that they just could never do in Doctor Who in the past because they didn't have the budget to do it. But to have 7 or 8 different types of monster, you had the face of Bo, you've got Cassandra, you've got the adherents of the repeated meme, a classic of course, the Mox of Balhoun, the tree people. Like, there's so many different aliens that were all thrown in. Some of them don't even have dialogue and they're just a costume in the background, and yet they've still put all the work and the effort into making those and making them look amazing to really show that this is Doctor Who with some money behind it that can actually really do a proper futuristic alien sort of space station with a collection of aliens to it. It's really great to see, I think. And so it very much provides you with the more sci-fi alien aspects of probably what classic Who is more well remembered for, but very much combining it with the new elements of the show that we've established in Rose, with the companion of Rose being much more of a real human being that has so much more focus as a character, and we see her dealing with the sort of challenges of facing aliens for the very first time in this episode and being just completely overwhelmed by how completely alien it is, which is just not something we ever really see in classic Who. To an extent, they're like, oh, what is that? Oh no. But for the way that Rose has to kind of cope with that and sort of suddenly just take it on and then doubting why she's even come in the first place, and it's just such an interesting dynamic that's explored straight off that's just not something we've ever really seen before, I think. I think CGI-wise, this is also a fairly ambitious story when you've got lots of CGI shots of this space station, of the Earth and the Sun, and then it's expanding and blowing and destroying the whole Earth. Like, that's all quite bold to try and do straight away, and certainly in 2005 it was a pretty big challenge, and Cassandra being CGI for the whole episode as well. But I feel like it still stands up reasonably well, particularly the sort of Sun and Earth shots. They really, I still feel reasonably convinced by them, and it feels like such a notable step up on classic Who. I mean, the budget is bigger and it's been a long time between the two, but it's still for me very noticeable that this is current special effects rather than 80s special effects. It sort of just feels like a big difference there, and it really helps to kind of just immerse you a bit more in the story, I think, when you're not constantly looking out for the dodgy bad CGI, which is a big step up, I think. Now, one of the kind of iconic things I think about this story is the use of the popular music tracks of Tainted Love and Toxic in this episode, which I feel like have kind of made the scenes in this episode to this day iconic. Like, every now and then I see the Toxic scene going around on Twitter again, because from people who aren't really fans of the show anymore, at least, and just remember that from their childhood, and it being such an iconic, the fact that in some futuristic alien space station they're playing Toxic as a sort of vintage classic piece of music from Earth is just such a bonkers RTD sort of silly idea that only he would come up with doing. And I think it all fits so perfectly and just kind of makes it such an iconic moment, iconic scene, and just you always kind of remember that, oh yeah, End of the World, that's the episode where they play Toxic in it and things like that. It's just, I think it just, so much of Series 1 has so much nostalgia around it, but so much sort of iconic scenes in so many different episodes. You've got the farting aliens of the Slitheen, you've got the first ever Dalek scenes. There's just, as I'll come through in the videos to come out of each episode, but there's just so many of those kind of scenes, and I feel like straight off in this episode we're already kind of establishing those iconic nostalgic scenes to the show. Speaking of the music, I think one of the kind of more negative things is which I noticed in episode 1 in Rose, and I also noticed again in this episode, is the slightly poor music mixing. I think is probably the best way to put it in some of these early New Who episodes. Of course, it's always kind of a cliched problem really in early New Who with Murray Gold. His music was too big and bombastic, and it was badly edited, so it always overpowered the dialogue and things like that. And sometimes I noticed it, sometimes I didn't in the past. I didn't think about it that much, but then I was watching it again. I was watching the Blu-ray Steelbook in headphones, and there are scenes where it's very clear, at least sounding in headphones, that the music is way too loud compared to the dialogue. Like, you can barely hear the dialogue when you clearly should be able to, because the music is overpowering it massively. The music itself is really good. I really like it. Of course, we've got more introductions of the Doctor's theme and Rose's theme in this episode. It's just some real kind of iconic classic Doctor Who music now, really, because it's been so well established in the show for such a long period of time. But certainly it feels like at this early stage in these first few episodes that the music mixing isn't quite on point, and almost reminds me more of Classic Who, I think, than New Who, really. But then I feel like there's also always been some problems with the mixing of the sound in Doctor Who. Like, there are a lot of episodes where it's not perfect. There's a dodgy scene where it's too loud or too quiet, or something's wrong with it. So maybe I'm leaning a little bit too critical, but it was just something I noticed while watching the episode. But as an actual story, I feel like it's a really interesting and exciting one. Yes, it's still a reasonably basic plotline, a classic sort of, well, there's the hidden Doctor Who villain of Cassandra through this episode. We think it's the adherents of the Peter Meme and these spiders, but then it turns out it's actually Cassandra, and she's just doing it all to try and make some money and some profit, which is kind of a classic Doctor Who-y idea to do, but to have it nicely set on this big space station with all these aliens, it's just something that could never have been done before, I think is really, really cool and interesting to see. And kind of watching these first 2 episodes, and hopefully as we go through the series, I'd to an extent forgotten how much of a focus this series puts on the Time War and the Doctor's past and Gallifrey and the Time Lords and how that all played out, when obviously at this point, from the audience's point of view, we don't know anything about this really. We're only getting these few very first hints, but I'm surprised how much there is actually of talk about it. We learn in this episode that the Doctor is a Time Lord and that his planet was destroyed in some big war, and it just and see, you see almost a tear, I think, from Christopher Eccleston's eye at one point when the tree person, I can't remember her name, I think it's Cheem, who is talking to him about it, and you can tell how much it's affecting him straight off, and we see that in some of the decision making that he makes. Letting Cassandra just die and burn out towards the end of this episode is not the sort of thing I think we would see later on in Doctor Who, because the Doctor's kind of mellowed out a little bit more, got a little bit more mercy that he kind of lost in the Time War, and I think that's a really interesting idea to explore, that we see just some of the seeds being sown in this episode that's then further explored through Series 1, which is really, really interesting. I feel like it's another interesting episode for the Doctor and Rose relationship. It kind of starts with the Doctor sort of trying to show off and impress Rose, but then kind of the real conflict between the two, when it's actually he was too busy thinking about himself and impressing her and not thinking about the real life and the fact that she's seeing the world die, seeing where her mum's dead and buried in the ground, and she's seeing all of that because she's in the future, is a really kind of interesting idea, which again is just not something that had ever been covered before. It's just giving us all these new ideas, kind of giving the companions a new outlook, a new viewpoint, a new question, I think, of being more questioning of the Doctor and less sure of him that we see from some of the earlier ones than Rose, which is just a really interesting dynamic to introduce straight away into the show, and I think it's really just gives a little bit of tension to the relationship, but it also feels like they are really, really good friends, certainly by the end of this episode, when Rose starts to learn a little bit, as we the audience do, about the Doctor's past and Gallifrey and so on. Not named Gallifrey at this point, of course, but the planets that he used to come from. And you can just see that real, when he says, I'm the last of the Time Lords, I'm the only one left, and there's no one else, and then she's like, well, you've got me. And you can just tell there's just that first little hint of them really wanting to spend lots of time together and really do want to go on adventures together, and that relationship building, and I think that's a really, really nice moment and a nice scene to really show that kind of development of their relationship through these first 2 episodes, which I think then is kind of gradually at times as solidifying, with obviously the moments where it feels like Rose needs to rein in the Doctor in later episodes, and that does come out a little bit here when she's telling the Doctor to kind of stop and save Cassandra, even though he's choosing not to, which is what we learn a lot more about in the future, of course. And just watching this episode, it does, yes, have so much nostalgia to it, but it also does just feel like a really, really strong episode, a really interesting and engaging episode throughout, where there's not really a dull moment where there's not so much going on. You're always intrigued by the Doctor and his past, getting hints about that. Of course, the whole main plotline of the story, people getting killed, sun filter rising and descending, and all the drama around that, of course, is really cool. As I mentioned, the pop music in there as well just adds a little extra element to it that I think just works really, really well, and so I can totally understand why an episode like this would keep the audience captivated to keep watching throughout the series. An interesting thing that I read in relation to this episode is that Russell T Davies originally wanted this episode to air back-to-back with Rose on the 26th of March for the first episode. He wanted to run them off each other, but I think apparently he submitted his request a little bit too late, so they weren't able to change the schedules to be able to do that. And in many ways, I think I'm happy about that. I mean, obviously, it was back at the time when I would have been 7 and I probably wouldn't have really thought about it. But nowadays, I feel like it did work better by giving the week to wait until the next one so that you can really sort of think about that first episode and really get the PR and the hype around that first episode before the second one's announced. Because I'm pretty sure that between episode 1 and 2, we had both the second series being commissioned and Chris Eccleston announcing he was going to be leaving the role of the Doctor at the end of this series. So it meant there was a lot of hype around who the next Doctor would be, even after only the first episode had aired, which I think is really, really interesting, and just sort of tells us how much, back when Doctor Who was starting, how much it was in the headlines. I can think it was sort of a daily thing for most of that week, really. Between Rose and the End of the World, there was another story to do with Doctor Who. This what was a nerdy sci-fi show is suddenly in the headlines every single day because there's these big revelations and big things happening in regards to the future of the programme and things changing. And so I don't think it was ideal for the show that Chris Eccleston was announced as leaving straight away. I'm pretty sure that was kind of an accident that happened. Kind of Chris wasn't very good at denying it on TV shows when he did interviews and things, and it just kind of, I think, leaked out basically at one point, so they kind of had to announce it, because I feel like that might have been the one time you could have possibly got away with having a surprise regeneration, because the internet was still to an extent in its infancy, and it was such, they hadn't confirmed it before the series had started, so it could have been a real shock for the end of the series to be, wow, the Doctor suddenly changed already, what's going on? So yeah, that was a little bit of a shame. I think that was never able to be kept under wraps, but just did help really ultimately the PR of the show, I think. But it's still notable that Doctor Who, I went and had a look back at the ratings and some articles around it, and there was the drama of Doctor Who loses a quarter of its viewing figures after just one episode, because it went from nearly 10 million down to 7.5 million for the second episode. And so we as fans, of course, love to be doom-mongers and scaremongers and say, oh no, the show's going to end because it lost 200,000 viewers since last week. Well, after one episode, it was already losing a quarter of its viewing figures, so this is a discussion we've basically been having since 2005, and the show has survived up until now, so there's no reason to think it won't keep on going. But yeah, so that's my general thoughts and feelings about the End of the World and some of the context at the time for this episode. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on that episode down in the comments below. It really is a great one, isn't it? But I hope you guys have enjoyed this video and are enjoying this series of videos. Of course, I'll be back again next Thursday to have a look back at The Unquiet Dead, Doctor Who's first historical in the new era of Doctor Who, something very interesting, and I'm looking forward to watching again and giving another review of. But I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. As always, hit the like button, the subscribe button if you're new here, and I'll see you again very soon for another one. Goodbye.